Hi, I'm Bryan Schrader, and you're listening to Outstanding in Your Field, powered by Pioneer Agronomy. I'm here with my co-hosts, agronomist Carl Joern and Crystal Williams.
Think of us as IT for your crops. If we know how to fix your issues, we'll tell you. And if not, we've probably got a workaround.
And if we don't, we'll find one because Mother Nature isn't like an on-off switch.
Well, there's no doubt that planter maintenance is incredibly important. And so what we did today was we found three of the experts within Indiana and Illinois to come onto the podcast and talk to us a little bit about what you need to do for your planter maintenance and some things that you can get ready to do even here as we just are maybe a month away from planting. And so we're joined today. Crystal and Carl were able to make these arrangements. So I'll allow each of them to kind of introduce the guests that they invited on, and then we'll have the guest tell us a little bit about themselves and their operation. Carl, how about we start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. No, I'm pleased to introduce Matt Risley. He's the technology specialist at Petersen Ag Service. Matt's been with the team for over a dozen seasons now already. Time flies by. Over at Petersen Ag, they specialize in ag leader products in addition to precision planting. And Matt is, knee deep in planter preparations, maintenance, rebuilds, all that good stuff, in addition to all the other technology components that come along with those two businesses. So they're located out of Remington, Indiana, which is west central Indiana-ish for those of you not from town. And yeah, Matt, thanks for joining us, and looking forward to getting into things here in a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Carl.
In Illinois, I have brought on Jake and Connor Finley.
Yeah, I'm Jake Finley. We're Finley Farms, LLC. My dad started selling back in the early 90s. So, yeah, we've just continued to grow the business since then and hopefully keep growing.
Yeah, and like Jake said, I'm Connor Finley. I'm Jake's younger brother. You know, we've grown up with farming in our background for a long time, and we were growing up through high school and into college. I mean, Pioneer was a huge part of the business. Like I said, we kind of started from the beginning with it, and it's just grown into a pretty large business.
Appreciate that, fellas. As I reflect on spring being upon us, like Brian had stated, as we get underway here, sounds like you all are the three parties on the line are heavily interested, invested in the success of your customers when it relates to the planter getting up and going. First question for Matt, your family farms. How do you feel about current state of affairs as it relates to being able to pull the planter out of the shed and get going for your family farm? And then also, what does that look like as you're looking at a whole bunch of planters that are piled up in the lot to get ready to get going for plant 2026? Are you feeling like we're a ways off, or is everybody getting ready to get going here?
Yeah, absolutely. The weather's finally started to turn back to sunny days in this central Indiana here, and so we're finally getting planters moved around. Some of the spring tools are back outside, so people are starting to think about it. And then we've got guys calling to update systems as far as liquid systems and like the wear parts, coming, what should we be pulling apart? The ones that didn't do it in the summer, there are definitely pulling them out and getting the phone calls started. So, the sunnier days, everybody gets a little more antsy. So,
Matt, you and Jake and Connor have both mentioned this idea of wear parts. Now, having hung out with guys like yourself before, I know what that means, but that's not always something that everybody necessarily thinks about. And at least it's been my experience that they don't think about all of the wear parts. And so I guess, Matt, here again, I'll start with you a little bit. When you guys are getting a planter in the first time and doing that initial inspection, what would be the go-to places that you would look at right away that are the most common failure points, the places that are most worn on a planter, even that's had, fairly decent maintenance on it? Where should guys start if they're looking to try to make sure their planter's ready to go?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the easier checks would be your disc opener widths, just making sure that disc openers are truly the right width or the right diameter there, and then that they're set correctly. Some planters are easier than others to dig in and dive into pulling those apart and shimming correctly, but that's an easy one that really affects the main, trench of that seed. So, if that's not set, we're already striking out on setting that trench correctly.
Yeah.
You know, going out from there, there's a seed tube guard that's, you want that set correctly and not wore down. I think that gets missed a lot when those seed discs are open. It's right there, and people miss it. So I think those deeper, those are the simple ones that, get wore down on the different types of soils quickly. So, and as we're speeding up these planters, that's definitely getting wore as well. So.
Yeah. Jake, Connor, how about you guys? What do you think? I mean, would you concur with that? Do you have some other things that maybe you would send your customers into? I'll tell you guys, I'm curious about the differences that we see today between you guys just because of where you farm at. And it's too bad there wasn't somebody over here on the eastern side where we bounce around rocks and some of that kind of stuff to talk about too. But I'd be curious your guys' take on what Matt shared or things that you might look for that doesn't make maybe quite as much sense in Matt's part of the world to take a look at.
Yeah, I mean, he hit the nail on the head with disc openers for sure. One thing to add on to the disc openers as well is not just checking diameter, but bearings. A lot of guys will just go through and check diameter, and if they're measuring within spec, they say okay, it's good. Well, we do see a fairly high number of disc openers that have been on for a while that the bearings are shot. So that is one thing that we harp on pretty hard with that. Beyond that, between that and the seed tube guard, your gauge wheel and gauge wheel arms. That is directly correlated to setting your depth and maintaining your depth. And getting those again set properly. And there's a million different aftermarket options for some of that stuff, but just we really try to hone in on the education of that stuff, because if we got a guy that wants to put all the bells and whistles on his planter, well, if the guts and the wear parts are not up to snuff, you're just putting a Band-Aid on. So I mean that's one thing that we really look at in a high replacement item, as well as parallel arms. Parallel arms go often way too long, I would say, without getting looked at. Especially again to that getting that consistent depth, and with any kind of downforce system, if you're going to add it to it, if you're going to put a hydraulic downforce system on and that row unit components are shot, again, you're not going to get the performance out of that system that you're desiring.
Well, and I think you bring up a good point, and I think back because your comments about the old Meter Max machines and running those units and everything, that dates back. I remember piles of those sitting around in reps places and everything, and we spend a great deal of time making sure that we get good, consistent seed drop, whether we run meters or they use some of the technologies that you guys have got. But it certainly seems to me, at least for my part of the world in Eastern Indiana, getting consistent seeding depth is probably more important for us even than spacing in a lot of respects, just because of the kind of soil types and fighting clods. And so it's funny to me when I watch a guy plant and he comes to the end of the field and not all the units quite hang the same, I guess, is maybe I would say that, because you've got worn parts or parts that are bound up or things like that. And so that's an interesting call out that I think is something that we need to look at on a more regular basis. There are unfortunately a lot of planters, as we've talked about, because of the economics, that need to be gone through maybe just a tick better than they have been in the past, I'm afraid. So
Bryan,
yeah,
as it relates to that, for an uninitiated agronomist here, as it relates to planter setup, you all tell me, maybe we'll start with Connor and Jake and then move to Matt for this one. But how does one really ensure you've got proper depth set? I know there's the gauge wheels, associated with this, and I've heard of folks using 2x4s and making sure everything's, running tight with the discs. But, for somebody that does this once a year, and maybe it's only, their 10th crop, maybe dad's been doing it prior to that. What is the proper technique to ensure that you've got the right seed depth placement there?
There's yes. I mean, if nobody's heard of what we're doing a lot of now is depth calibration, and different planters, different row units have different ways of doing that. I mean, there are certain row units where you can adjust you can truly calibrate it, with the mechanisms, but your standard John Deere XP row unit or Max Merge Plus, you got your T handle, right? You're moving that into your, making sure everything's the same. That was the status quo, right? Making sure every single row unit's the same. Well, when you do these depth calibrations, you've got your set and seed, which are you can buy, or like we just got a floor jack that we made a 2-inch, basically 2-inch blocks on the side of it to where your gauge wheels will go on that, but then you jack it up and then you move your T handle to where, and that's to get yourself at 2 inches. And that's usually what we calibrate to. And the shocking part is, you could go across a 16-row planter and, you may get 10 to 12 of them that are the same, but, it's not uncommon to get 3, 4, 5, 6 that you may have to be one notch different to truly be at 2 inches. And then you start looking at other wear parts in there, your rockers and your screws, that stuff on a John Deere row unit or on a Kinsey, on your gauge wheel arms, the little dog bone in there, how much wear is in there as well. But getting that true consistent depth calibrated is a big deal. And it's a little, it's a mental game for a lot of guys when they look at it, but we just try and make sure that when we do that for a guy that we use, a paint marker or some way that they can keep track of that and know that when you're starting, you're at 2 inches. So then you can make your minor adjustments from there when you're setting your depth out in the field when you're checking.
Matt, anything that we missed in that department?
Absolutely. Connor nailed it with, they're not, some of them are not definitely going to be the same, and you got to get over that OCD of they've got to be the same, and truly you've measured it, so that's true measure. So I've heard stories where they've measured it and then they got to the field and it's like, well, we've never done that, that's not set right, so then they change them, and it's like you've measured them in the shop, like why would they be different in the field? So
sure.
Just trust that, and those wear parts that acquire to those depth of those mustaches and things like that need to be will stand out there and measure out. So
guys, I don't want to call anybody out here by name or anything, but I am a little curious. Sometimes it helps folks to understand the extremes. So I guess I'd be curious, maybe some of the most extreme, not necessarily poor maintenance per se, but I'd be curious just so we could kind of define the ditches for folks. Maybe give us an example of something that's come into one of your shops that you've looked at that's been just unbelievably out of spec that you guys have been able to kind of fix either with new wear parts or with realignment or those kind of things, just so people sometimes may not necessarily realize just how out of spec their planters are. I'd be curious if you could give us a couple examples that folks could think about that maybe over time, because Carl mentioned they only do this one time a year, they're not seeing that year after year. There's 12-month separation between when they did it the last time, just to help folks understand just how extreme sometimes these wear parts can get.
Yeah, I've had one Kinsey planter pull in, and the 3000 series are metal shanks, and so if you hit something hard enough, they'll bend. And trying to get some of the disc opener set right, and you're like, why is this this isn't even rolling right, and you look back and it's like, man, this thing's bent. Like, we got to replace the whole shank on here, like, to even get this thing to work right. Like, we need to replace the whole shank. So some of those things are a lot, I've seen a couple, and people have broken bent them in the field, and they'll catch
Sure.
it. That's your sensors and everything will definitely catch, that gauge wheels aren't running right, or, and so had some, when he talks about the parallel arms, you can, basically pick it up and walk it around, wall it around, and you're like, wow, this thing is really, shot. So, and those were all, I think the customer knew that, and that's why obviously it was in the shop, and we were going through it to do, to replace those, but it got that far.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing to add on to that is you said, I guess what popped in my head when you said alignment is, a lot of guys are doing repair kits on closing tails and or adding, a spiked wheel of some kind. That is one thing that is drastically overlooked is centering your closing tails. Majority of your OEM closing tails can be adjusted side to side. So that is one thing that we look at a lot, doing a scratch test out in the driveway or whatever, and making sure that closing tail is running centered. And like I said, to Matt's point, you can pick out a lot of faulty things that maybe you didn't see, by doing that, of whether that row unit's running off to one side or another. But like I said, getting those closing tails really true and centered, especially as we start adding on there's a million different options as far as closing wheels now, and everybody's trying different ones. That is a pretty critical point to make sure that you're really focusing on now too, because there are options out there where you have sensors there on a closing system, but most of the time that's pretty blind. Most of the time it's pretty blind. So that's one thing that we look at a lot, and making sure that those closing tails are not completely worn out to where you can't keep it centered. So that when you brought up alignment, that's a big one that popped into my head.
Speaking of the closing systems, closing wheels, what have you, I feel as though that's of even greater importance as you look at, folks planting more quickly, whether it's a high-speed planter, if we're just, creeping by at another couple miles an hour than what we did 10, 15 years ago. That's one of the things that I reflect on as a big technological leap here in the last 10 years or so, is being able to plant closer to 10 miles an hour instead of, 3 miles an hour, what have you. I am curious though. There's a lot of technology on these planters today, whether it's sensors, wiring harnesses, if it's the monitor itself. What's one piece of advice that you would have for folks related to technology before the planter ever hits the field? What's part of that maintenance plan besides just the wear parts? What advice would you have for folks in that space?
I'll start off by saying probably the updates are you're going to start there first, is get it to that newest firmware that they flash. Both ag leader precision, when you call in or call the tech that's out there, we're all trained on the newest firmware, and that's what we want to support. And so yes, it worked last year on the old firmware, but there could be that bug fix or something on new firmware. Second piece is going to be your grower, farm, and field list, and if you've made any updates on boundaries that you need to clear out or move or change boundaries, and you picked up new farms, you picked up you lost farms, getting that list set so we're not sitting in that field, planter unfolded, ready to go, and now we can't plant because we're jacking around, adding a farm, adding a field. Trying to get a guidance line set. If we can do that all in February, March, early time frame, you're going to pull in and feel more confident on getting that planter set up and have one less thing to worry about when you're pulled in.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with Matt on that. I mean, the other thing that we run into fairly often is, not being made aware that customer made a tractor change. The planter's the same, but they did make an update on a tractor. Well, if you've got row shut off set up for that, or you updated GPS equipment to a different brand or something different that directly affects all those things with that planter. I mean, it's going to affect your timings, your shutoff, so measurements, GPS signal. Get a guy that calls and said, hey, we don't have, I'm not getting any GPS signal on my monitor. What's going on here? Well, we do have adapters and changes of those things. So just keeping that in mind, that when you do make a change, yes, the planter hasn't changed, but the tractor has changed. So there could be measurements that change. There could be hitch height changes, all those types of things that do directly correlate back to the planter performance. So that is another thing to really keep in the back of your mind of if anything changes between those two things, you're going to have to do some recalibration for sure.
I want to go back a step, go maybe a little bit more analog. Connor, you mentioned closing wheels. One of the questions as an agronomist I get a lot is about which closing wheels are the right ones to use. The guys that are using, I'm old school enough where guys were using one cast and one something else and things like that. I'd be curious in terms of your guys' take and Matt's take on what the best option is. Certainly the one that works is the best option, but I think everybody's got their favorite kind of setup. I'd be curious because it's such a common question for me, and I only see what guys are doing in the field. I don't have an opportunity to test or do those kind of things, and I certainly know Precision has done a lot of that work over the years. But I'd be curious, what's kind of your go-to closing setup for you guys that you make a recommendation on, and what that looks like and maybe why?
Yeah, and I mean so I would agree that that's a very loaded question, a very common question of what do I do? Well, at the end of the day, you're typically, my first question is, well, what's your budget? Because you can, I mean, the Cadillac, I do believe is a two-stage closing system. I believe is the Cadillac. Case IH has had a two-stage closing system for a long time, and there's been more and more aftermarket options to do that, but that comes at a cost. What I would say in our area, at least, the most common, most popular is going to, a Yetter poly twister or the Copperhead furrow cruisers. That is a fairly cheap improvement that is very flexible. That is one thing that we like about it, whether it's conventional, no-till, strip-till, vertical till. They work in a numerous various conditions. So that is probably the most common one that we see. But again, it comes back to, that getting to know that customer and really what they're after and what they're doing. Because soil types change drastically in some places. I mean, even, Crystal, you can attest to this. I mean, we are pretty lucky where we're at. We have pretty forgiving soils, but you don't have to get too far away. And we have, one of the largest sand mines in the country not too far from us. We got a lot of guys that farm around that. That drastically changes, your approach in that situation. But I would say, the most common is some type of poly spiked wheel is the most common in our area.
Matt, what about you? I know that you guys probably go far enough north that they get into even some of that muck and some of that stuff potentially. So I'd be curious what your recommendation is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like Connor said, it's all field based or customer based and planter based. If the planter's moving at 8 mile an hour, 10 mile an hour, we need to change that up to, and if compared to 5 mile an hour, we're moving, just like you said, the poly spiked wheels. There is a cast spiked wheel that we're moving a lot on some planters. That's definitely definitely a good option, and getting that trench closed and setting that, if your downforce is right, that closing wheel should be able to stitch it right in and close it right up. So it's definitely planter and field all conditions, variables. So
As I think about, we talked about like the biggest challenges that you see coming in and out of your shop. Flip it to like the more positive end now. So if you think about of all your customers, somebody that's got a really fine detail in really knocking it out of the park in terms of planer technology or just even calibration and getting everything up to par, I guess, what is one thing that they're doing that you see other customers are not?
I mean, as far as I would say the tip top guys, I mean, they are, guys that are wanting to do it themselves. I mean, they're going through the effort of tearing apart that bottom end of that row unit and checking shim on disc openers every year. Because that shim will change over time as the diameter of that disc opener starts wearing down. So the guys that are really up to snuff on it, like I said, they're checking that, they're reshimming disc openers every year, and then when they're putting it back together, they're reshimming their gauge wheel arms, and just making sure, and even doing that depth calibration year over year as components start to wear. Now, in the economy that we are in, I guess, leading up to this, when times were better, I mean, if you were floating around of like, hey, we got some wear here, there wasn't much pushback on, we'll just replace it. Well, now I would say more in the last 12 months here, we've been on, okay, can we get another year or two out of this, and what can we do to make this right? So, really just guys going through the effort to make sure that all those things are correct, even with a little bit of wear. We can still make this right, but there is going to be some time and effort involved into getting that done.
yeah, absolutely. And I would say even, they've got the wear parts figured out, but that first day out in the field, they need to recheck their settings on shutoffs and the measurements. If they go through the whole crop and don't check it and they're 4 foot off, they're going to have a skip, a gap, and overplant, and then it's going to be our fault that it wasn't done right. And it's like, well, that's the get out and dig and check and make sure all your there's truly seeds every the population that you want, and it's truly shutting off at your indrows, and it's at it's at the depth, and it's truly closing. So I mean, I think that's huge. And then also those guest rows, if you're planting 30 inches, you don't want one 24 and 36. So just those are simple checks that seem like they just we're going to plant this whole field and then get out and look, and it's like, well, we need to do that in the first round or two. So
yeah, I would agree with that on Matt's point 100%. I mean, all this stuff is great, but it's we're not automated enough yet in that world to not ground truth. You have to be willing to get out of the seat, and those top tier guys are, and ground truthing what they're seeing. That is a big deal, because it at the end of the day, it is still only as good as what you are telling it to do. So getting out of the seat, digging and ground truthing that is a big deal.
Guys, we've talked a lot about corn planters with so many 15 and 20 inch soybean planters. Are there other things that we need to be thinking about? A lot of times guys think planter's a planter. Yeah, they plant different crops. Is there something or anything different between the two planters that we need to think about in terms of all of these parts and all of this setup? I mean, a lot of the stuff we've talked about already, I feel like is applicable to both planters. But when we're kind of sitting there and looking in the shop, is there something or things we need to think about differently, whether it's the corn planter or the soybean planter?
I mean, I think taking the approach of, we worried so long about the corn planter, but beans anymore, they're not that cheap to put in the ground. So getting these guys' heads wrapped around of, we're not just, it's not, if you're going to do it with a 15-inch or a 20-inch planter or a 30-inch or whatever, we're actually planting the beans now, more than a controlled spill like we used to do. And there is some benefits starting to show up from that. So, I mean, just like you said, taking the same approach on both of them. I mean, it's almost just as critical, I believe, now with the beans, especially as earlier planting comes on, making sure we're getting our bang for our buck there. So, I mean, as far as differences between the two, I really wouldn't tell a guy anything different on his bean planter than I would on his corn planter, because all these components directly affect your performance. And like I said, just with the overall cost of putting a bean crop in the ground now, it's starting to become more and more critical.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's right on. It's you're planting that crop. We're singulating soybeans now instead of spilling them. Getting them in the right depth is huge now. Not just see one on top of the ground every once in a while and you're at the right depth. So the row cleaners are starting to be a thing for sure and then all the tech, to tech them out is there as well. So seeing the benefits of that downforce and, you're running across some no-tilled ground, and that's, even a bigger pay or bigger bang for that right depth, right downforce and getting them there.
Guys, this has been a really good conversation. I'm curious, as we begin to wrap a little bit, if you had one piece of advice for every farmer out there as they're dragging the planter out, whether they're doing the maintenance themselves, having something pass through your shop, what would that piece of advice be before they head to the field?
I'd say, get with your dealer, get with your, tech specialist, and, Facebook doesn't always have the right answers, and get with your trust advisor and figure it out and, walk through with them and you'll have a successful planting season.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I mean, we've done, we've made a pretty big push, especially in the last, I would say 5-6 years here of, let's not dig it out of the shed and take it straight to the field. We've been doing a lot more summer maintenance right after. Guys are like, well, we put it away ready. Well, that, it always feels like things break when they're in the shed, unfortunately. So yeah, getting it out in a timely manner, getting, one thing that we really do push on guys is getting those meters run, because even if you put it away ready to go, there's a lot of things that can happen, whether rodents or just anything, moisture, anything like that gets in those meters. Get them calibrated. I mean, meters, it's not that expensive in the grand scheme of things to get your meters checked out and make sure that they are up to snuff. I mean, that is one big thing that we do push pretty hard. Like I said, it's a simple thing to do. Get them over in a timely manner. Like I said, get them back. It's peace of mind. It's a very cheap insurance, in our opinion.
Okay. Well, guys, thank you very much. I think, the old saying that the most potential still in the bag, I think that's probably still right, but you can't go back and redo these planting operations once you put it in the ground. Anytime we have to do it a second time, we know it's never as good. And so with a lot of the work that you guys are doing, we're trying to get that just absolutely as right as we can. And I think it's a good call out that, especially as we've talked about with the economics of planting beans or planting your corn crop, making sure that you do everything you can before you head to the field the first time is crucially important to ensuring that yield when you go back in the fall, and being able to just do an absolutely good job. So we appreciate you guys helping us kind of think through that today. Hopefully some of our listeners have picked up something, whether that's as, kind of simple as updating that firmware that Matt talked about, or making sure that you've got everything in alignment like Jake and Connor have talked about today. Just crucially important that we get this right. And so anything else, guys, that we want to talk about or we want to mention before we sign off the podcast today? All right. Well, guys, we do appreciate the time. We thank you very much for joining the Outstanding in Your Field podcast today. And hopefully we picked up some things that will help us out when we go to the field here in just a few weeks. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
This has been another episode of Outstanding in Your Field. Like and follow our podcast wherever you are listening. We've got a new episode at least once a month. You can also find us on YouTube by following Pioneer Seeds. You can find me on Instagram at B_K_Schrader.
I'm Crystal Williams. You can contact me at crystal.williams@pioneer.com.
And I'm Carl Joern. You can follow along with me at Joern on X or on Facebook at Joern Agronomy. That's CJOERN.
That concludes this Pioneer Agronomy podcast. Visit our page on pioneer.com and follow us on Twitter and Facebook for more agronomy insights.